completed her Master's of Art in Art History at Concordia, also under Dr. Heather Gololite. She is the Executive Director of the Canadian Latin American Archaeology Society and remains active in researching Mesoamerica alongside First Nations visual culture. Her title is Storing Identity and Survivance Through Depictions of Sedna. Welcome.
So I would like to begin by acknowledging that we're located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gathered today. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within Montreal's community. So hello, my name is Catherine Florence, and this presentation is the product of my master's thesis under the supervision of Dr. Heather Gololite. I'm honored to be speaking here today and also recognize my position as a non-Indigenous person speaking about an Indigenous subject. My goal here is to recenter Inuit voices, providing the foundations for future research from these Inuit voices, and also to point out the ideas that are currently present in the Chalunaat mind that can be addressed. Thank you. On to what we all came here for, art history, yay! This presentation looks at Nuliajuk, epithetically called the Sea Woman and colloquially referred to as Sedna, and what making her image means to a handful of urban Inuk artists that I was able to interview, specifically in reference to how they're storying their identity through these tales of survivance and how they connect to the figure of Sedna herself. So, David Ruben Piqtoukun, Michael Massie, Heather Campbell, and Glenn Gear, two of which are here today. There's one in the back and one over there. They're all contemporary Inuk artists who experience physical and cultural dislocation of either residential schools, the Sixties Scoop, or the after effects of those events that still haunt this country. I got to sit down with them for in-depth interviews about their art and their paradigms, and by exploring these four artists who are experiencing and also projecting Nuliajuk's story, we can come to understand their art as a deliberate act of resistance to colonialism and attempts at cultural extermination. I'll discuss how they assert her importance as an icon of identity as Inuit and her position within their world as this ultimate survivor whom they relate their own understandings of survivance. So that being said, I should probably introduce Nuliajuk or Sedna. So one thing to note is that her story has just as many versions as she has names. Like, I have an entire paragraph of just different names from across the circumpolar region. So I really need to highlight that the very nature of oral history is to adapt to change and yet remains undeniably true despite these reiterations and these differences. What's said by one community might not be regarded the same by another. In fact, all four artists told me a different version of her story. But the purpose of this discussion is to give a context for these worldviews that could be applied to Sedna, but it's not authoritative fact. So you just have to listen to the story that each person will tell you. I'm going to give a very, very abridged version of this story, just so we all have context. So, a girl unknowingly marries a non-human husband and moves to an island where she is miserable with that husband because he's revealed to be a bird. Her father attempts to rescue his daughter and is caught mid-escape by the bird husband. The bird husband creates a storm to force the father to give up his daughter. Father decides, I'm going to do just that, and throws her out of the kayak and into the water. The girl, understandably, is like, that's not cool, and tries to hold on to the side of the kayak and is begging her father to help her, and instead the father cuts off her fingers so she can't hold onto the kayak. The fingers turn into the sea creatures, and the girl sinks to the bottom and becomes Nuliajuk, the Inuit of sea mammals. But as art historian Ruth B. Phillip points out, quote, sometimes, however, there is more to a story than its simple subject or even the storyline. Quite often, how the story is told is every bit as important as what the story is about because of the way of telling influences so many of its aspects, end quote. So in this line, there's no such thing as neutral art and therefore no such thing as neutral art history. So I want to draw attention to the fact that the story I just told you is very rarely depicted in art. Massie observed that, quote, most of the time it doesn't even talk about that, about who she is and why she's there, kind of thing, and how she became there. Most of the time it doesn't really tell you why she ended up losing her legs and getting a tail, end quote. These scenes in art usually take place after the story, after the beautiful woman has become the Inuit. And the violence inflicted on her hands is often downplayed, as we can even see in this picture. There's rarely any indication of blood. She simply has a mutilated hand that already appears healed. But at the heart of my research was this question about her tail. Piqtoukun, Campbell, and Gear had differing opinions on why she even had a tail. They see the hybrid form as more of a metaphoric and aesthetic choice than a literal translation from her story. Her tail is symbolic of her domain over the animals. It's a means of easy movement within the depths. It simply is what she is. And yet, in many of the texts I consulted, authors were quick to describe her as a mermaid. And when Quellenna came into the north in search of a passage, they left with myths of an inhuman landscape populated by beings beyond their comprehension. And in the process of colonization, they stole these stories, twisting and breaking them apart to fit into the folklore they knew. So all that is to say, Quellenna, when faced with this belief system entrenched in an ontological framework, decided, we reject your reality and substitute our own. They categorized Sedna as a mermaid in an act that imposed their understanding of gender, power, and society over a figure. And on the surface, as we can see from contemporary art, it would appear that it took. Yet, these days, even though she's almost always depicted with a tail, this is not out of concession to Quellenna influence, but in reclamation and by reconnecting it with an Inuit identity to the land. As I came to understand through my research, the original meanings were not only encoded into this induced morphology in resilience to colonist attempts to demote her importance within the cultural landscape, but newer contemporary associations of survivance have been imposed upon her image and the act of making her image. Essentially, artists said, we reject your rejection and have interpreted your additions according to our own reality. Her tale now carries culturally specific connotations that can only be deciphered with the comprehension of her story, in addition to the facets embedded within the beliefs surrounding Inuit. Yer even describes her as the original mermaid in terms of morphology, yet with the caveat that, quote, she's so much more powerful than what we think of as a siren or a mermaid. Maybe closer to siren, but she's even more powerful than a siren. Sedna is so not a mermaid, end quote. She's a specter, a provider, a protector, a mother, and a survivor. And as this presentation will show, these artists have connected each of these aspects to Inuit identity as a whole, as well as their own understanding of Sedna in the world around her. So, as explained independently by Indigenous scholars Joseph Brown and Sean Wilson, the intangible products of relationships, the processes of creating these networks of connection, are just as important as the eventual outcomes. And as Carla Totten said in her own master's thesis, quote, in this sense, the performance of storytelling is a process that can be used to interpret and intervene in colonial histories, to reestablish self-determined representations, to provoke political resistance, end quote. Through visual arts, the artists I interviewed are not just receiving, reviving, and reiterating old knowledge or creating and ascribing new meanings to the image of Sedna. Their actions are changing the framework of their entire worldview. And I would like to stress again that all four of them are urban. Recent generations still live under the shadow of the Scoop and residential schools, leaving descendants to reconnect these loose ends created from the abrupt loss of culture. And yet, now, Sedna's children are reclaiming their identity the same way through making art. Piqtoukun, Massie, Campbell, and Gear all mentioned that their art was a way of connecting to the past through oral stories, and I'm going to hopefully pronounce this right, Inuitak, I think I pronounced that right, of finding a way back to their heritage, lineage, or history that stemmed from an absence of the culture traditionally passed down through oral history and story work. During the era of colonial assimilation, stories were forcibly silenced, and yet they've managed to endure through the efforts of that relentless human refusal to fade into oblivion. For Piqtoukun, it's a means of looking back to look forwards, of preserving and reconnecting with the facets of his heritage that he was denied, even creating new interpretations. Quote, "That's the bottom line, is trying to interpret mythology, the stories, the legends. Well, these mythological stories, they're teaching me about my culture, about my identity," end quote. In this way, Nuliajuk defines who is Inuk and who is not, and moreover, how some are imagining that connection. Campbell explained how, quote, in an urban environment, it's hard to, feel the same connection that you feel when you're, in your hometown. But learning about Inuit spirituality really helps me, end quote. In Ottawa, Campbell is physically distanced from her community up north and her heritage. But through this artistic experimentation and explorations, she's found a way to bring this sense of belonging down south. And likewise, in Gear's video, Kabluna, tells the creation and settling of Halana in Labrador using archival photography, collage, and animation, and in addition to the story of Sedna's liaison with her faithful dog, which, again, it's another version of the story. There's lots of those. This connection to the land is a visceral proponent of Indigenous identity as a whole, and especially for urban Inuit artists. Gear's piece reinserts the historical into an imagined but very real coastal landscape, asserting the priority of Inuit over the settler colonat, while still tying the latter's origin to a figure of the land. Because to these people, there's still the sense that she's out there. Maybe not everyone, but to some there is. Making art, making these images of Sedna is a way they express their practice of culture even when dislocated from their traditional homes and communities. Moreover, Sedna also embodies an epistemological resource for dislocated artists and persons. The interviews I had revealed a deep connection between Sedna and the protection of knowledge. Knowledge is power, and whoever controls the production of knowledge controls the narrative. Thus, retelling her story in Inuit visual arts is just as important as telling her story orally. Piqtoukun said, quote, "Well, the sea goddess is symbolic of somebody who watches over. She's like a protector of our people, the animals, and the land, sea, and sky. And she protects the mythology of Inuit people. Because she's got that capacity to protect that knowledge. I call it protecting the pearl of wisdom. Even wisdom is very important to protect. Once it's lost forever," end quote. And in this sense, oral storytelling is valuable and yet very fragile. At times it's too personal to be expressed to an unrelated public. It's not performed at random, it has to be prompted, drawn to the forefront of the storyteller's mind. It's a constantly emerging narrative that's as infinite as our capabilities as humans, changing profoundly over the generations. But people disappear, and voices fall quiet, memories are forgotten. The spoken word has no material presence, and yet it endures through the retelling of her story through stone, paper, animation, bringing old truths into the present through new means and purposes. So according to Joel Visinor, survivance is, quote, "an active sense of presence, the continuance of native stories, not as a mere reaction or a survivable name," end quote. It blends resilience, endurance, and the reclamation of self-identity beyond the notion of survival into a place of thriving. As interpreted by Dale S. Blake, quote, the heritage provides the groundwork for successful adjustment, not leaving the past behind, but building on it to give a firm base for exploration outwards. This direction does not mean adhering slavishly to the dictates of yesteryear, but taking what is useful and valued and adding on to it. And in this sense, this is what Campbell embodies in her work. This adaptation to the modern age, this adaptation to new roles, to new means, to new experiences. And especially she, both as an artist and in speaking to Sedna herself, is this role model for women adapting to this new age, taking on new roles within the society. Sedna has moved beyond victimhood, where her father essentially threw her over the board to save herself, to godhood. Her Arctic waters endured centuries of ecological onslaught. Against every force of nature and spite, she refused to fade into oblivion. Hence, her image recalls tradition and insinuates continuity between past and present. Survivance in this manner is about living, about adapting and reclaiming. It's transforming history into presence and today into future. And that is something that Nuliajuk's story encapsulates beautifully. So this thesis sought to recenter voices of Inuit artists. Doing so has given me an intimate look into the motivations and values that the four artists have inscribed in their work. Yet it's also important to note that they draw the symbols through which to communicate from a larger collective worldview. Each conversation I had with Massie, Piqtoukun, Gear, and Campbell illuminated how making art was more than something they do. It was a process embedded in their concept of identity, a space for navigating their relationships with past, present, here, there, self, and community, a platform for expressing discontent and disconnection alongside resilience and return. Moreover, these interviews provided a perch from which to peer at the broader landscape of communities still handling the dispossession from colonialism, without letting that trauma overwhelm the discussion, while these forces continue to shape Inuit and Halana encounters and discussions. I hope I have demonstrated that the depiction of Sedna is more than merely recapitulating an old tale about a long-vanished god with a beautiful piscine tale. Her depiction braids together culture, identity, society, wrapped in a continuity and the embrace of community. Sedna's tale is one of tradition, of holding on to the ways of one's people, of valuing the blood that runs in your veins because it connects you to your community and the land, no matter how distant those may feel. Her tale is one of transformation, of rising to face the hardships of environment and colonialism, of becoming something greater despite the loss. Sedna is an expression of contemporary urban and rural Inuit endurance, resurgence, and self-determination through art, and of reclamation and resilience as unrelenting as the tides. Yeah.
I love that you foregrounded the oral interviews and the really rich connection between the images and the oral narratives around these images. Wonderful. Any questions?
Is the tale of Sedna known all over the north, from the Groenland to Alaska?
Yes and no. The thing about saying the tale of Sedna is that she as a figure might be known under different names, and again, her story, there are so many versions of her story. They all end essentially the same way, with her fingers being cut off, those turned into the sea mammals, and she becomes the Inuit of the sea mammals. But how she gets to that position often changes. But yeah, across at least the ocean capable communities, there's usually at least one story or some inclination.
There's a question in the back.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why didn't you talk about the hand tattoos? Because the hand tattoos in the Sedna story go hand in hand, quite literally.
I very much appreciate that pun. I love puns. I wanted to, but the constraints of the time I had to do these interviews, as well as to do my research, only some resources actually talked about the tattoos, others didn't even mention them. I wanted to, and if I have a chance to revisit this, I definitely will look into those, because that was something I noticed, and I was just like, oh my god, that's so interesting. How do I fit this in?
Oh yeah, because when I was growing up, in person, they were saying They were telling you the stories, they were getting their hand tattoos because the hand tattoos are symbolic of womanhood and creation story. And I know you said it was a myth, but I think it's really important to say that the story of Nuliajuk is cosmology and how we believe creatures came into this world, and she was also the mother of our sled dogs.
Yeah.
Which, yeah. And part of the reason why her name was Nuliajuk is because she didn't want to get married, and her dad forced her to marry that dog husband.
Yeah, again, different versions of the story all over the place. And yeah, and that is something I try, and I forgot to bring it up in the presentation, but I do try and stress whenever I am talking about myths and oral history, is that just because it's the story told by somebody else, just because we call it a myth doesn't make it any less real. I might not believe in Sedna as a physical being or as a real presence, but that doesn't make her any less real to somebody else. And I acknowledge that, and that this story is true. It might not be the reality for me, but it is true.
It's slightly off angle, but did you at any time come across a reference to a male Sedna? Because I interviewed an artist in Cape Dorset who did Sedna families, and I said, are there male Sednas? And he said, of course, because how would she have a baby? And there were two artists who actually did Sedna. Did you come across anything like that?
I came across, when I was originally trying to find artists to interview, I did come across a few of those depictions, and I believe I tried to reach out to the artist. Again, I could only contact artists who made it possible for me to contact them. They either had information or their own website where I could contact them, and I think those were some of the ones that I couldn't. They're only represented through galleries, and galleries don't want you to talk to their artists.
Yeah, it's just interesting in terms of gender.
It is very interesting in terms
And
of
these were
gender.
male artists.
Yeah.
So it's-
Yeah, it is very interesting.
At no point did you connect Sedna to shamanism.
I
Sedna is not just a protector and good figure. She's also the figure that creates the storms in which hunters die all the time. And we've got to placate Sedna. And there's actually a lot of art that represents
Yeah.
Sedna, where you have the shaman going, making the journey, and then combing her hair. But this makes Sedna a much more complex figure.
She is very complex, and that is something I do address in my actual thesis. In fact, my favorite quote is from Glenn, where he says, "She's scary. She's scary as hell." And it is true. She's not entirely good. She's not entirely bad. She's very human in that aspect. And I wish I could have explored that here, but it wasn't exactly about storing identity.
Well, we can definitely continue these conversations
Yes.
after the, I'm sorry, but we are out of time. But yeah, many great conversations. Thank you.